title of my talk is, What If We Could Begin Again? We have spent 2 days talking about the quite apparent fact that things must change. We are aware that seminaries cannot continue the way things are going. And we aren't the only ones that know these things. Almost all of our seminaries are beginning, at least, to ponder these challenges up, as Doug said today, our predicament. And we know, those of us in seminary education at least, that it is easy to get caught up solely on the question of how to keep our institutions alive. And with that, we think about survival. It's a strong motivator. In fact, survival is often a primary mandate given to presidents by their boards. Survival, along with its best friend, fear, can overtake how we think and do and be in the world. I want to talk about two futures. The first future one, I believe, is motivated out of fear and a deep desire to keep our institutions alive at all costs for as long as possible. This future, I believe, will lead to the ultimate demise of rigorous theological education, not just in seminaries, but writ large in the church, with resulting detriment to the academy, the church, communities of faith, and society. Future two may, if we can step into it, yet breathe life into the things we care most about in the academy, the church, communities of faith, and society. I would like to contrast some elements of each. Future one, full of fear, frantic to keep up with the good old days for as long as we can, days that never really were as good as we remember them to be. So we tighten our belts here and there, just hoping to get through this rough patch, to get to the point where things will surely be better. In other words, we stick our heads into the sand. In business terms, it is cutting costs and focusing on getting a larger share of the shrinking market. This future has an attitude that says, or maybe it doesn't say, but it embodies, we offer the best theological education. Of course we know what we're doing. We're the big guys in the game. We prepare religious leaders better than anyone else. Of course students will come to us. And this future simply assumes that students will come. We just need to tweak our business model. We need to market more effectively, recruit more aggressively, and tighten our belts. As Nadia Bolz-Weber would say, we are redesigning the phone booth. Bottom line, future fear has as its primary focus keeping some semblance of our present institutional life viable for as long as possible. The future is the way we're going right now, and honestly, that future sounds to me like no future at all. Let me describe another possible future. We'll call this future hopeful, even if it's a little bit scary. As opposed to focusing on the future of today's forms of theological education, this future has as its focus theological education for the future. The church for the future, meeting the needs of God's world for today and tomorrow. As opposed to concentrating on saving institutions as we know them, this future spends all its energy and all its resources on the mission of the institution as it will become. This future is willing to look itself fully in the face with brutal honesty. It is willing to put everything on the table. I'm not talking about a willingness to put some things on the table. I'm talking about a willingness to put everything on the table. All of our assumptions, all of our presuppositions, all of our structures. This future must recognize the ways our privilege continue to operate. White privilege, male privilege, cisgender privilege, heteronormative privilege, economic privilege, and yes, Christian privilege. This future must recognize the many ways there are of building community. This future recognizes that new models must come into place. The basis of this future has moved from accumulations and acquisitions to access. Access to learning, access to ideas and thoughts, access to bibliographic resources, access to people, access to participatory culture, access to service. This future seeks to find the emerging new markets and consequently employs new metrics for measuring success, even as it seeks to create partnerships and alliances. This future will have recognized, using business terminology, the drivers of change, unsustainable costs, the existence of viable alternatives, the evidence of declining usage, and new customer demands. And we will be about responding to those drivers. Do we know exactly what this new future looks like? Clearly we do not. But I have some speculations, some of which I will share with you. I'm thinking that this theological education for the future will probably focus on lifelong learning and lifelong service. It will be about finding ways to make itself, that is theological education, available. It will understand that people cannot pick up their lives and move to study in one place for a set number of years. It will recognize the many motivations for wanting to learn. It will recognize the declining demand for the traditional just because it is the traditional. It will recognize that we are caught between the historical demand for the gold standard of graduate level theological education and the emerging religious needs of society, the church, communities of faith, individuals in the academy. It will recognize that our current modes of authorization may change as our denominational bodies change and as higher education changes. It will recognize that the MDiv is one among many paths to achieving a theological education. It will recognize that the church for the future may look very little like the church of today. It will create alternative reward structures. It will recognize that the underpinnings of our current curricula are indefensible, and it will already be in the process of building a curriculum from the ground up. This curriculum will honor traditions, to be sure, but you notice I said traditions with an S. This curriculum will bring forward the best of our traditions and create relevance for today. Curriculum will recognize our global and pluralistic context. At the planning table for this curriculum will be many faces, many different faces from many different places. It will recognize many ways of learning. It will attend to many ways of creating community. It may need to consider even what it means to be a seminary. It will recognize that we can no longer rely on the goodwill of our constituencies, that we will have to actively demonstrate value to students and communities of faith, faculty, academy, society, and to our donors. Most of all, it will have as a primary motivator one of being relevant to the needs of God's creation. Now let's be more concrete. Think about some of our seminaries. I can't do every single seminary that's represented here tonight, but I've picked a few. Think about the beginnings of the seminaries represented here. Bangor Theological Seminary had a different beginning in rural Maine than the cosmopolitan Bostonians. When churches were experiencing the revival movements in the early 19th century and recognized the need for leaders in the northern tier of New England and New York, leaders who understood the needs of coastal, agricultural, and mill communities and saw the need to create an institution that would have a national and international profile. Or take Central Seminary. Generous women helped fund and found Central from its beginning in 1901 as the first freestanding Baptist seminary west of the Mississippi. These women recognized a great need in their fledgling churches. Kansas City was a pioneering river town built on the hills surrounding the confluence of the Missouri and Kaw rivers, as mapped by Lewis and Clark. Baptist in heritage, Central's founding vision was simply training ministers of the gospel for this developing land. It remains so, but with a global reach. Chicago Theological Seminary came about because of the need for pastors in the emerging agricultural communities, river towns, small cities, and immigrant settlements of what was then the American West. Those who formed the real CTS felt that, sorry, Matt's gone, felt that the churches serving these new communities needed pastors trained in and for this context, rather than bringing in East Coast transplants who were more accustomed to the culture of established communities. LSTC was formed in 1962 from the planned merger and relocation of 4 Midwestern Lutheran seminaries, the only such formation of its type, a voluntary decision of 4 predecessor institutions, soon thereafter joined by a 5th, to dissolve and recombine specifically in order to carry out a new educational ministry on Chicago's South Side. LSTC's institutional DNA includes the twin impulses to innovate for the sake of educational mission and to partner with others in doing so, so that some 2 decades after its founding, LSTC welcomed into its work a 6th school, Christ Seminary Seminex, which left its home tradition in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod for the sake of academic and scholarly freedom. McCormick Theological Seminary was founded originally in Hanover, Indiana in 1829 before moving to Chicago prior to the Civil War. Cyrus McCormick, an entrepreneur, industrialist, Presbyterian layperson, had as part of his vision for the growing city of Chicago the founding of a seminary that would train pastors for the western frontier and the emerging communities that made up the city. United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, with its beautiful birth story out of Yankton and Mission House roots, came to us because a church, the United Church of Christ, wanted to claim the excitement of a new denomination, because a church wanted to celebrate the ecumenical spirit which inspired the creation of the church. Notice something. These are all contextual foundings. Motivations were a powerful source of inspiration and energy for visionary founders, faculty, administration, students, and donors. Together, they sensed a kind of calling, something like, we are here for an urgent purpose. Without this institution, something critical would be missing from the religious and cultural landscape of our place and time. What if we today begin to think about ourselves as founders, not merely inheritors or survivors, but founders? I want to suggest to us that we better wake up and smell the coffee. If we don't, we will see in theological education what we have seen in the move from Borders to Amazon, and Amazon to ebooks, Blockbuster to Netflix DVDs, and Netflix DVDs to e-streaming, Tower Records to iTunes, iTunes to Pandora, taxis to Uber, retail stores to online purchases, and even libraries to Google. It is no accident that all of my examples have something to do with technology. And so we have a significant challenge because we, as an enterprise, have never been very good at appropriating new technologies. We have consistently been followers. We have to snap out of that pattern. One thing is clear to me: we will not be relevant just because we want to be, just because we think we deserve it. We will have to demonstrate relevance. What if our schools and our efforts were to imagine that we were beginning again? What urgent religious, cultural, social, and political realities would be shaping the schools that we would be creating? What would be the basis for our refounding? Here are some realities that I think must shape our thinking, as, to borrow from and adapt a book title well known, we seek to begin again for the first time. Reality 1, a relentless demographic shift in which an aging white majority will seek to maintain cultural and economic dominance in the face of growing and more youthful Latino, Latina, and Asian populations. Reality 2, a generational shift in operation, a shift that is far more interested in spiritual exploration and depth of community than in institutional maintenance. Reality 3, persistent racism made more complex and oppressive by growing diversity within African American communities, by the growing strength of Latino, Latina, and Asian communities, and above all, by the reluctance of large portions of white communities to recognize and relinquish privilege. This world we continue to live in is a world created by white privilege and white supremacy, a world that refuses to acknowledge the implications of that privilege and supremacy. Reality 4, growing religious conservatism, aided in part by immigrant communities that seeks to reopen questions of the leadership and agency of women, that resists the broader cultural acceptance of LGBTQ communities, that rejects any tempering of American exceptionalism, and that maintains the privileging of the human species at the peril of God's creation. Reality 5, theological conservatism that responds to secularism and postmodern impulses by reasserting old orthodoxies and resisting or excluding theological daring and imagination. Reality 6, growing economic inequality encouraged and facilitated by the political and financial sectors of all partisan types. Reality 7, a growing sense of personal empowerment, at least in some segments of our culture, where the agency of individual decision makes creating an expectation for customized services and a participatory culture. Reality 8, vibrant interfaith presence that will continue to grow more challenging as minority religious communities become more diverse and as they grow larger and more confident and therefore are more able and willing to challenge the norms and privileges of the once dominant Christian community. Reality 9, rapid changes in higher education and credentialing mechanisms. Take graphic design, for example. One can get a degree in graphic design, but employers are now requiring certifications in various systems. And we are seeing in many, if not most denominations, changes in credentialing and authorization for ministry. In my own denomination, the UCC, for example, we used to require an MDiv for ordination. Now, we have, as we should have, multiple paths to ministry. Reality 10, that's the last one of those. We live in a world that is increasingly not bound by the conservative liberal paradigm, by the progressive evangelical paradigm, out of which our curricula and institutions and behaviors operate. Now, of course, none of our seminaries are really going to begin again. We carry, as we determine to carry, institutional responsibilities and mandates, personalities, traditions, ecclesiastical expectations, and so on. Matters that are either important to carry with us or are very difficult to shed. That said, these emerging realities that I named, and there are probably more, provide opportunities and challenges that could be as exciting and energizing as those facing our founders. We need to see them not as threats to our survival, but rather as impetus for our renewal, whether that be individual renewal or renewal found from various forms of collaboration. These realities suggest to me some things about theological education. They suggest theological education for the future should have certain characteristics. Relevant theological education We'll welcome a more diverse faculty and student body. We'll have curricula that are sensitive, culturally sensitive, curricula that will be equipping leaders capable of helping our majority white mainline congregations address more faithfully the demographic shifts that are taking place. Relevant theological education will explore curricula that no longer privileges preaching at the expense of framed, deep theological conversation, ritual, liturgy, and practices. Relevant theological education will integrate a posture of anti-racism into the curricula, but not just into the curricula, into the institution, recognizing and challenging explicit and implicit white privilege and supremacy. And we will be about developing white people into persons who can collaborate around issues of race. Relevant theological education will provide the theological and biblical grounding for justice and mercy, as well as global sensitivity oriented toward just peace. Relevant theological education will reward theological imagination and support intellectual risk. Relevant theological education will prepare religious leaders with greater fluency in economic issues so that they might teach and preach for greater change, as it also prepares them to speak loudly and effectively in the public square on behalf of the disenfranchised. Relevant theological education will be real about the gifts and opportunities of interreligious engagement, while also maintaining a non-naive stance with regard to possible challenges. Relevant theological education will attend to changes in credentialing, both in higher education and in our denominations, and all the implications therein. Relevant theological education will refuse the categories of liberal versus conservative, progressive versus evangelical, and will instead move toward generous listening. Generous listening being assuming the good intent of the other, the person to whom we are listening. We're listening to hear as opposed to listening to respond. We will assume in generous listening that the other person has the best intention to make a positive difference in the world. Relevant theological education then will recognize explicitly our vast interdependence, and it will operate out of that interdependence as a way of being. By our heritage, we are founders. And I would conclude, based on this analysis, that we are the founders of 2015. While we have the challenge of maintaining institutions, we also have the exciting work of building new places and doing things that would not happen were it not for our implementing our mission. We have some choices about this time in which we find ourselves. We can take this time to be worrywarts, to wring our hands over the survival of our churches and our seminaries that we have known and loved. We can view this time as one of struggle to maintain the services that we believe need to be maintained. And we could view this time as an opportunity, a chance to grasp what is right out in front of us. To this, I want to close with a slight modification on a scripture that we all know. Who knows but what we have come to this place for such a time as this? We do not have time to wait and see what happens. Our time is now. This is our moment. Who knows but what we have come to this place for this time? And we, right here in this room, we are the people to do it. We must not wait for someone else around us to pick up this task. That someone else is us. Who knows but what you and you and you and you are in this place for such a time as this. Thank you for thinking with me about these matters.